Good afternoon. This is David Unsworth, host of the PanAm Post English podcast. President Trump scored a major victory this week at the Supreme Court, which ruled to uphold his September 24th travel ban, while various appeals work their way through the federal courts. The ban bars citizens of 6 Muslim-majority countries, as well as North Korea, and certain Venezuelan officials and their families from entering the United States. However, it is not a blanket ban, as work, study, and family relationships will be considered for allowing entry. The court has stated that visa applicants from these countries must demonstrate a bona fide relationship with the United States. Did the Supreme Court make the right decision? Will further challenges make their way to the Supreme Court in this term? Is this a Muslim ban, as its opponents claim? And what do the American people think about this ban? The Supreme Court allowing this ban to go into effect is not exactly the same as upholding the ban unconditionally. It is a temporary decision, but it is very likely to be a prescient indicator of the court's thinking in the future. One thing that bodes well for Trump here is that this was a 7-2 ruling in which only Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sonia Sotomayor dissented. That means that a Clinton appointee, Stephen Breyer, and a Obama appointee, Elena Kagan, ruled in favor of allowing the ban to take effect. So what are the specifics of the ban? Chad, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen are the 6 Muslim-majority countries affected by the ban. There are also North Korea and not Venezuelan citizens, but officials associated with the regime of Nicolas Maduro that are prohibited from entering the United States. Trump's retweet of supposed anti-Muslim videos has played into the arguments for opponents of the ban and their rationale for calling for its repeal. Fundamentally, the court felt that irreparable harm could occur to the United States because the rationale for Trump's ban is based on national security and foreign policy concerns. So, again, the plaintiffs in the case, the people that are arguing against the ban, among others the American Civil Liberties Union, have said this fight is not over. They are continuing with appeals, particularly appeals in the San Francisco-based 9th Circuit Court of Appeals and the Richmond-based 4th Circuit Court of Appeals. Now, the current Supreme Court term ends in June of 2018, and there have been indications from these 4th and 9th Circuit Appeals courts that they are expediting review of these pending cases, which makes it quite likely that the Supreme Court will make a final determination on this case in the current term. Now, it's not exactly a blanket ban. There are some particular provisions for each country. For example, citizens of Iran are still allowed visas, but they are subject to greater screening. There are also exceptions that if you have a student visa, if you have family members in the United States, or if you have a contract to work in the United States, those are all taken into consideration. Now let's hear what the Trump administration is arguing and what the plaintiffs in this case are arguing. White House spokesman Hogan Gidley said, "We are not surprised by today's Supreme Court decision permitting immediate enforcement of the President's proclamation limiting travel from countries presenting heightened risks of terrorism. The proclamation is lawful and essential to protecting our homeland. We look forward to presenting a fuller defense of the proclamation as the pending cases work their way through the courts." The Center for Constitutional Rights, on the other hand, noted, "We will not allow this to become the new normal. Whatever the courts say, the Muslim ban is inhumane and discriminatory. We must continue to demonstrate that we reject and will resist the politics of fear, anti-Muslim racism, and white supremacy." Now, the current Muslim population of the world is 1.6 billion. Taking a look at the populations of the countries affected, it amounts to slightly under 10% of the world's Muslims who are affected by this ban. Looking at the figures here, Iran at 80 million, Yemen at 27 million, Syria at 18 million, Chad and Somalia each at 14 million, and Libya at 6 million. So I would argue this is not a Muslim ban. If it was a Muslim ban, it would affect the entire Muslim world. But there are no restrictions on the world's most populous Muslim nations: Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Egypt. I mean, in those four nations alone, you have, if I'm not mistaken, approaching half of the world's Muslim population. Previously, the Supreme Court had said in June that the U.S. government could bar travelers from these 6 countries, but only if they lacked a direct connection to the United States. Polls have generally shown considerable majority of the United States agrees with the Trump administration on this. What I always have to say here is, clearly we cannot treat all countries the same when it comes to issuing green cards, visas, our immigration policy. You can't treat Spain, Switzerland, and Sweden the same way as Syria, Somalia, and Sudan. It's just impossible. Let's take a look at Syria, for example. Right now, about a third of Syria is controlled by Bashar al-Assad, a third is controlled by al-Qaeda-linked jihadists and another group known as Jabhat al-Nusra, and a smaller percent of territory is controlled by ISIS. How exactly are we supposed to get reliable information on the dangers posed by potential Syrian immigrants or refugees? I mean, these are all groups who utterly despise the United States, Israel, and our interests, both foreign and domestic. Are we supposed to call up, say, the regime of Bashar al-Assad, or al-Qaeda jihadist elements, or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, to ask them to help us vet these potential Syrian refugees? I mean, it's just ludicrous. When it comes down to it, how do we vet Syrian refugees? Well, there really isn't a very good way to vet Syrian refugees. It's pretty near well impossible at this point. And we need to do a cost-benefit analysis here. No one is saying, I don't think I've heard a Republican or Libertarian say, you know what, screw them, we should just leave them to their own devices and do nothing in the midst of a raging Syrian civil war. We should do something, and I would be proud and happy to have some of my tax dollars go to humanitarian relief. But clearly a simple cost-benefit analysis here, it's far better off to keep them in the Middle East. And I mean, the cost alone of relocating them to the United States, flying them here, they're Arabic speakers, they're not English speakers. I haven't done a detailed analysis, but I would venture to bet that for the cost of relocating one Syrian refugee to the United States, you could pay for the humanitarian needs of 10 or 15 or 20 Syrians relocated somewhere in Turkey or in Jordan or another neighboring country that is not in the midst of a war. Furthermore, we really need to point out here, the United States is not responsible for the Syrian civil war. With one caveat. Clearly, the Syria-Iraq border, the disastrous situation in Iraq, the breakdown between Sunnis and Shiites, and the Sykes-Picot agreement, which led to the border between Syria and Iraq. Clearly, the instability in Iraq has allowed some overflow and allowed these dangerous terrorist groups, jihadist groups, to wage war on the Syrian government. But nonetheless, we have little to do with the Syrian war here. I mean, we've been a long-term geopolitical enemy of Bashar al-Assad, but the Sunni jihadist groups that are taking him on are even worse, and I would argue a far greater threat to the United States and to American citizens. So, on a humanitarian level, I think we should do something here, but that does not mean we should take in Syrian refugees by the tens or hundreds of thousands or millions. I mean, that is just insane, and if you poll the American people, you consistently see that there is not support for something like that. Now, under Article 2 of the Constitution, the Supreme Court has routinely ruled that the President conducts our foreign policy and handles immigration matters. Now, These groups, like the Center for Constitutional Reform and the American Civil Liberties Union and so forth, they are making their arguments against the travel ban on, in my mind, pretty flimsy pretexts as someone who believes in a strict constructionist interpretation. They really have three pillars here that they're using to attack the travel ban. Due process, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and provisions of the First Amendment that government can make no law respecting an establishment of religion. These arguments do not hold up under scrutiny. And I think that the Trump administration was absolutely correct here when it said, quote, federal courts have no more, the Center for Constitutional Reform has said, federal courts have no more sacred role than protecting marginalized groups against irrational discriminatory conduct. Now, here's what I don't understand. How are people that are in Chad, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, Libya, who want to come to the United States, they are not entitled to rights under the 14th Amendment, in my mind. This is not a black and white matter. There's plenty of gray area here, but the idea that someone who is not an American citizen, someone who is living in Yemen or Somalia or Syria, let's say, says, well, I have equal protection under the 14th Amendment to come to the United States. Well, that's absolutely ludicrous. That is absolutely ludicrous. No one has an ironclad right to come to the United States from any country. That's just preposterous. I mean, nations are sovereign, borders are real, regardless of what the social justice warriors and many in the Democratic Party would like to tell you. Where does it say anywhere in our Constitution or in our immigration law that you have a right to come to the United States because you are a citizen of another country? The threat here is real. I mean, these are countries completely beyond the control of any central government. Syria, Yemen, Libya, what is taking place there is utterly astounding. I mean, really, as it stands now, they're controlled by various local fundamentalist militias who despise the United States and their interests. I mean, just last week we saw that in Libya they're now setting up slave markets. They're capturing African migrants from Nigeria and Niger who are trying to make it to Europe and selling them as slaves. In Yemen, a significant chunk of the eastern part of the country is just straight up controlled by Al-Qaeda as the country degenerates into a Sunni-Shia civil war, with Iran backing the Houthis, who are Shia, and Saudi Arabia backing the Sunnis. And needless to say, the situation in Syria is far worse than even in Libya and Yemen. Now, here is a quote from our immigration law. Whenever the President finds that the entry of any aliens or of any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, he may, by proclamation, and for such period as he shall deem necessary, suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens as immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of aliens any restrictions he may deem to be appropriate. So it would appear to be pretty cut and dry here. The ACLU and the social justice warriors may not like that the reality that there are extremely serious threats posed in these countries that are in the midst of civil wars, but it's not a Muslim ban. If you want to call it a Muslim ban, call it a Muslim ban on 10% of the world's Muslim population that is dealing with radical jihadism, terrorism, massive instability. It's not a Muslim ban. If it was a Muslim ban, it would ban 1.6 billion people. This bans 160 million from geopolitical hotspots, from places where it's really impossible to vet people. to this day, no one has said to me, none of my friends on the left have come up with a credible plan for how you are going to vet people from a nation like Syria, which is controlled by, whether they're Shia or Alawite or Sunni, which is controlled by radical religious fundamentalists, all of whom have absolutely no interest in protecting the United States or American citizens. So, in conclusion, it's very likely that in the next 6 months, the Supreme Court is going to issue a final decision on this, but I think particularly, and I will link to this New York Times article here where I got this quote from our immigration law. The president has broad power on this. This is the executive branch's domain, and unless with the current composition of the court, I think it's highly unlikely that the travel ban is going to be overturned in the future. Perhaps an upcoming ruling is going to be closer, like a 6-3 or a 5-4 ruling, but this 7-2 ruling, with the support of Elena Kagan and Stephen Breyer, I think clearly demonstrates which way the court is leaning, and I would be very surprised if the travel ban is not upheld this term. This has been David Unsworth with the PanAm Post English podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel.